Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to the third session of our Early Career Speaker Series, hosted by the Institute for the Study of Contemporary Anti-Semitism at Indiana University. My name is Jean McGill, and I'm the Assistant Director and Graduate Secretary for the Bourne's Jewish Studies program here at IU, and I'm pleased to be your moderator today. This series showcases the innovative work of early career scholars who are bringing fresh perspectives to the study of anti-Semitism. Over the course of October, November, and December, we'll hear from 6 speakers across 3 sessions. Each session will run for about 90 minutes, with each speaker presenting for roughly 30 minutes, followed by a Q&A. We're thrilled to have you with us for today's third session, which explores the theme Anti-Semitism and the Digital Sphere. We have 2 outstanding speakers lined up. Our first speaker is Daniel Malin, currently the Sumerian Research Fellow at the Institute for the Study of Contemporary Anti-Semitism at Indiana University, Bloomington. Daniel's research focuses on misinformation dissemination, contemporary anti-Semitism, and conspiracy narratives on social media. His interdisciplinary approach blends computational social science and linguistics to examine political communication in user-generated content. Daniel earned his PhD in general linguistics from the Technical University of Berlin. His dissertation, Understanding Online Anti-Semitism, Hate Speech and Web 2.0, was published by Nomos in 2024. His current work centers on developing new methodologies to tackle the challenges of studying online media. Daniel, welcome. We're looking forward to your talk.
And thank you so much for joining to this session. So as you can see, my research is centered on the platform YouTube, as the slide shows. And this is more or less a result today that I will present that is part, or a couple of these findings are part of 2 previously published studies. And it's about effect mobilization on YouTube, as the title says. And we are specifically interested in how do people react to video content on the platform, the so-called YouTube Shorts. And that is meant when I speak throughout this talk about user-generated content. All right, so this presentation, as I said, will be about research findings, and I just get started. So this is the empirical source that I used. So as I mentioned already, I was focusing on YouTube. And just a little side note about YouTube. According to the website Meltwater, YouTube is, after Google, the 2nd most visited website in the World Wide Web. And is it actually the website where users spend most of their time overall. And data acquisition began, as you can see on the top of this slide, roughly 2 weeks after the Hamas attacks on Israel on October 7. And it focuses, as I mentioned, on the so-called YouTube Shorts. So in particular, on the comments and replies as reactions to these videos. And they cover more or less an entire year. So we cover the material from October 7, 2023 until October 7, 2024. And for those of you who don't know what a short video is, or YouTube Short is, it's more or less the equivalent to the so-called TikTok. So it's a rectangular video. I will show a few examples just in a second, that has approximately a duration of, let's say, 30, maybe sometimes up to 2.5 minutes. So that content is, from my point of view, perfect to more or less condense a lot of emotion and information in content, in videos. And it's suitable, of course, to use it in recommendation systems like on YouTube that are algorithmically controlled. In other words, these videos just pop into your feed, and if you don't stop watching, then one after another will come up, and maybe at a certain point it will stop, but I haven't tried it. Like, it just will go on forever. So they create, well, first of all, a large viewership, lots of engagement, and not just likes, but also comments. And that is very specific for YouTube because that is in comparison to other platforms like TikTok, actually a space where people spend a lot of time talking about the content, whereas when you look at TikTok, people just react very often with, I don't know, very short responses. So that tells us a lot already about the audience. So these are more or less sorry, I have to put down the tone. This are 4 examples from YouTube Shorts. And I'm specifically interested in state-funded news outlets, as I mentioned in the beginning. So following the Hamas attacks on Israel, there was, of course, an immense amount of news coverage, not just offline, but also online. And that led then to an explosion of the so-called user-generated content, the comments and replies. And when I looked back at the research that was already published, I noticed that a lot of the studies that are out there, and focus on online communication or on global crisis, for example, the Ukraine war also, they were primarily focusing on platforms such as Twitter. That has many reasons, because Twitter in the past was an accessible platform, gave us good option to script data. That is not as easy today, so that changed. However, still a lot of studies focus on that platform, and of course there are also other studies that focus, for example, on fringe communities like 4chan, Telegram. So there's a lot of stuff out there. However, from my point of view, YouTube was kind of understudied, and I noticed that it became, as I mentioned already, since it's the second most visited website worldwide, it became central to algorithmically accelerated political communication. And the findings suggest that, as I will show in just a couple minutes, that millions of users are engaging in that content. So this is more or less the corpus, the material, the empirical data that we used for a study. And you can see that over the course of 1 year, we gathered 2,370 YouTube Shorts, and they come from 4 state-funded news outlets. So from the top to the bottom, we see the DW, that's funded by the German government, Al Jazeera by Qatar. BBC actually denies that it's funded by the British government. But it's definitely incentivized. And then there is TRT World, which also denies that they have direct ties to the Erdogan regime, but it functions as, more or less as a state media channel. And yeah, over the course then of this year, more or less like these 2,370 videos, they generated 3.4 million comments and replies to these videos. And these interactions, they give us actually a large-scale insight in how the users respond emotionally and perhaps also ideologically to global political narratives. So that is more or less the baseline for this study. This slide shows you, looks maybe a little confusing, but this is more or less a picture of the upload patterns. And what we can see here is that TRT and Al Jazeera dominate the uploads. So they consistently post 30 to 40 videos per week that are thematically related to the Israel-Hamas war. BBC and DW show a slower, and I would say it looks like a more sporadic activity, and they rarely exceed 10 videos per week. However, this does not necessarily explain that or indicate that these 2 outlets, DW and BBC, don't focus on the conflict. They just probably use a different format to cover that kind of material. Nevertheless, when we look at this slide, the graph, we see that it illustrates trends, and we can see that certain state-funded outlets, especially Al Jazeera and TRT, they view YouTube with algorithmically driven content, and that is already a sign that they try to influence the digital discourse on the platform. So this is a little this is a very technical slide. I try actually not to explain the method now in detail because that may be boring for most of you, but I try to quickly explain what we try or what the focus of this study was. So we first of all want to know as much possible about these millions of comments and replies as reactions to these videos, and we need to interpret them linguistically. And for that purpose, we used a method that is called aspect-based sentiment analysis, which helps to identify who and what is being talked and how it's evaluated. So for instance, it more or less allows us to see whether someone speaks positively about Palestinians, but negatively about Zionists in the same sentence. And it's it's more or less, if you look through the material from a quantitative through a quantitative lens, it's more or less like a microscope for meaning. So instead of counting words, it reveals the stances. It shows us how emotion and ideology are expressed through language. And when we look then at the aggregated results, we can find patterns that reveal the stances, and they show us changes over time. And we can also see how polarization unfolds and how it changes, which actors people align with, for example, which they reject, and how those alignments then, of course, shift after, for example, key events. So rather than just measuring hate or hate speech in general, this approach allows us to trace how emotion more or less turns into ideology and how everyday users, how they engage in online commentary, how they reflect, and how they express their emotion, and how this changes the emotional climate. And that gives us then, of course, information about what nurtures contemporary anti-Semitism, what are the speech patterns that indicate it. And that's what I'm trying to show you today, at least from a qualitative point of view. So I'll start with a little quantitative insight. So you can see on this slide, on the right-hand side, you can see an aggregated sentiment distribution. So it allows us, first of all, to get a general overview of the user-generated reactions. And you can see here, these are more or less the so-called aspects that we identified. We identified the stances towards them, what emotions got expressed. And when we zoom out, we can then, of course, aggregate these sentiments and get a general idea how people evaluate these aspects. And what we can see here is that Israel and Zionists are viewed overwhelmingly negative. Palestinians and Muslims, for example, they are framed more neutrally and positively. But what's very interesting here is when we look at the aspect Zionists and compare it to the aspect Hamas, for example, we can see that Zionists attract much more negative sentiment in the digital mainstream discourse as Hamas does. And that already suggests that the anti-Zionist framings have become, they probably have become normalized even before October 7, but they surpass the criticism of terrorist organizations. I think that is already an interesting finding. So it indicates a persistent normalization of anti-Zionist content within the mainstream web. Then I'd like to show you also another graph that sheds light on the longitudinal dynamics. So again, when we look at the aggregated data over time, we can identify so-called spikes in the discourse that sometimes correspond with geopolitical and cultural events. So I can't, unfortunately, not go into the curves I can't go into detail by looking at this graph, but I'd like to mention that it was, for example, there was a spike during the Eurovision Song Contest in Malmö 2024, where, for example, the anti-Israel sentiment surged within the user-generated content. We also observed that during the allegations of the International Crime Court of Justice towards Israel, that we also could see a spike in anti-Israel attitudes within the comment section. And that is also very interesting during Israel's Independence Day. We see, and that is confirmed now by several studies, that we see that the polarized discourse intensifies during the anniversary. And in general, what we also saw, the material covers a lot of different topics, but one topic that was, well, in comparison to the other ones, very broadly covered by these news outlets were the campus protests, the encampments, and of course the rallies. And we saw that the aggregated data gives a clear, well, it shows more or less a negative shift toward aspect terms like Zionists that very often get framed as colonizers or systemic oppressors in these discourse strands. So overall, when we look at this graph, we can see the sentiment is not static toward these aspect categories, and it reflects, of course, event-driven polarization. However, sometimes we also found that although there was, for example, a spike here, although that's a neutral spike, but let's say this spike towards Zionists on the bottom half of the graph on the left-hand side, we saw that it was sometimes not at all connected to the video material that the outlets were publishing. So in other words, we found out that when people just hear something that is maybe about Israel or Zionists, they get triggered by it. And that gives us already an idea that there is something like a deeply entrenched resentment that gets triggered. So people, regardless of what the subject covers, try to express negative things and also very often anti-Semitic attitudes. So I'd like to use now a couple minutes to go into these events and explain a few, let's say, linguistic examples. So here we can see, first of all, the short videos that were published by 3 outlets. So we can see Eden Golan singing in Malmö, where the crowd was more or less booing her out. Also, I think during the practice session, and we see DW and TOT, they show the counter protest, right? Because they were not happy that Israel was participating in the Eurovision Song Contest. And not just offline, but also online, the crowd serves always as a moral barometer. And I just used now, and in the following slides, I will also just use brief examples that illustrate what we found, and that is also an attempt to reflect the patterns that we see in the content. So when we look at the first comment that I just highlighted here, that user writes, "Well done to the audience, Free Palestine now." So very common, people use exclamation and repetition acts as, for example, emotional intensifiers. And offline, but also online, the crowd becomes more or less the world who is judging about the participation of Israel, and they perform more or less the collective moral verdict. In other words, the world has spoken and we are not agreeing with Israel that it's participating. So we can see this more or less as a form of critique that the user expresses here. Then we have also, for example, comments that, well, indicate a moral incrimination through labels. So that person writes, "Irish people didn't ask to reward the baby killers," right? And this label reactivates the blood libel frame. So in other words, an ancient accusation of ritual cruelty that is now repackaged as moral outrage. Israel isn't described here politically, but morally, and it is more or less the embodiment of evil. So we can definitely see here a move from critique into demonization. And then we have also a lot of comments that legitimize exclusion through, for example, accusations of genocide. So Israel should be kicked out of all sport. They are committing genocide. And what we can see here by pairing the modal should with genocide accusations, this comment more or less turns outrage into justification, and it constructs a sort of moral logic where exclusion becomes the righteous response. So taken together, when we look at this discourse event, we see, based on these 3 examples, well, a common and repetitive pragmatic sequence that is very typical in anti-Semitic discourse. It starts with judgment, it goes over into condemnation, and then it goes over into expulsion. And this is more or less enacted through the emotional language. The second discourse strand, because as I said, it was not completely related to the spikes that popped up all the time, because these encampments were existing throughout many months, and universities and these rallies more or less were part of 2023, 2024. And this is more or less just a little selection that shows what the outlets again cover when they talk about or spot or highlight the Israel-Hamas conflict. So what we can see, there are many comments that draw colonial analogies. So for example, here Israel is framed as a colonial settler project. And what's also very common when people express emotions, we can see all caps and nouns tagging. So here colonial, genocidal, terrorist, Zionist, a terror Zionist. So they more or less condense emotion and rage. And in the anti-Semitic discourse, it's also very common that Zionist, for example, serves as, well, a substitute for Jew, and that allows them to express hatred through, more or less a political vocabulary. However, this substitution strategy very often covers hostility towards Jews, and that is something then that people interpret just as political critique. Also very common, nothing new, we have the apartheid accusation connected with the genocide formula. So we have very often fixed so-called collocations. So apartheid and genocide, they are popping up very frequently together, and they work more or less as semantic amplifiers. So they've used two historically loaded accusations into one emotional framework. And what's also very interesting, I mentioned it already, the deeply entrenched resentment. So when we look at this last comment here, well, it actually has nothing to do with the videos itself. So that is something what I meant when people get triggered by something, right? They see something, people write something about Jews, but this more or less is completely unrelated to the context of these videos. So we found these classic anti-Semitic tropes in the comment sections in which users more or less expressed hostile or accusatory sentiment towards Jews. And they were referring here to the crucifixion of Jesus, like the deicide accusation. And we found, what we also found that's also very interesting, makes a lot of trouble when you apply quantitative analysis, is when people translate something into English. So we found a lot of content that, for example, does syntactically not make a lot of sense, but you can derive the meaning if you look at the content, but you can, like, it gives us at least an idea that the people were translating something, I don't know, through maybe Google Translator from, I don't know, let's say Urdu, Arabic, or French into English, and then the syntax is sometimes not correct. So the last discourse event that I briefly want to mention is connected to Yom Ha'atzmaut and the Israel's Independence Day. And what we saw there was also very interesting because the content that was that we found in these aggregations was sometimes the exact same content that we found on other platforms. So, for example, users on TRT and Al Jazeera cross-posted near identical content within hours, sometimes even the exact same phrases and the exact same vocabulary. So they more or less produced a synchronized spike in outrage. And here in example one, we can see again, we can see something that is, I describe as inherited guilt and moral escalation. So here child killers support child killers. Descendants of European settlers continue their genocide. And here we see the repetition, child killers. Well, it has the potential to create something like a ritualized accusation, while the ancestry terms descendants of settlers transfer more or less the guilt genealogically. And this is an interesting example because it illustrates an historical echo of the blood libel, because moral blame gets reshaped and it manifests from the historical past into the present, and that of course increases then the potential to transform the Jewish identity into something that I call heretic guilt. Then, of course, also not surprising, people use irony and sarcasm. So here the users more or less uses irony when he or she or they state Israel has the right to defend itself, but then adds from innocent children and elderly people. So this twist creates a rhetorical inversion, and it pretends to affirm, of course, Israel's right to defend itself while also actually criticizing it, implying that Israel targets more or less civilians and children rather than combatants. And then we have also a lot of anti-Israel content that is delegitimizing the nationhood. Here we can see a Zionist regime that pretends to create a Jewish nation. So we have here to create, which more or less is used as a grammatical strategy, as a to create something like well, a concept that allows a denial of Jewish self-determination. So this is just a little selection of patterns that we found. Unfortunately, I don't have time to go into more of these details, but yeah, we have a lot of classic anti-Semitic tropes that are well, get reshaped and get manifest into the content of the Israel-Hamas war. I'd like to use now the remaining time to more or less look also again into the lexical patterns that are unrelated to discourse events. And this slide summarizes a few of them. So what we observe here in our studies were not just isolated insults, but speech patterns that show a complex interplay of language and emotion, and they merge into something that reveals then later the ideological alignment. And what we found were, for example, the semiotic markers that serve as very often as visual amplifiers. So they create more or less the rhythm of a ritualized celebration framework that transforms, well, violence into something what I very often call the quote-unquote friendly face of anti-Semitism. And linguistically, these signs function as emotional signals, and they give us information of belonging and also identity. Then well, that is a methodical problem that I just want to quickly mention. When we apply quantitative classifiers in that regard, we use transformer models. There's no method that I'm aware of, at least, that has not its limitations. So we have to deal with a conceptual ambiguity. In other words, these models have always a chance to predict a majority of the content if you fine-tune them correctly, but sometimes they also predict something not correct, and that is called a false positive. So here we have the example, Free Palestine from Hamas. That was possible to distinguish. So here the sentiment towards Palestine is positive, whereas the sentiment towards Hamas is negative. But when we look at the other example that states Free Pages from Palestine, well, lexically does indicate that it's positive towards Palestine, but if you know about the discourse, then it more or less is just reveals something else. So such lexical ambiguity can sometimes mislead the quantitative classifiers. So in general, and on the surface, we see a very high frequency of such content that is lexically positive, but contextually it reveals camouflage strategies, and these are very typical in social media because they enable the users to embed irony and coded antagonism. And therefore, we need always, when we do quantitative analysis, we need domain adaptation. So that means language changes constantly, and therefore we need to retrain and to fine-tune our classifiers, since, of course, the semantic meaning evolves maybe over time, so it means that the meaning can change. So on the right-hand side, you can see also additional emotive patterns. So we can see here examples that indicate support or denial frames. So common phrases are here, can you prove, which delegitimizes, of course, evidence that Hamas murdered children. And this reframes, of course, terrorism as something as collective defense. Then we have also, and that is very important to stretch for a moment, we have lots of selective approval. What is meant by that? So when our classifiers are identifying positive sentiments towards Jews, this does not necessarily reflect that the sentiment is positive in general towards all Jews. So the selective approval shows us that sometimes just a certain subgroup of Jews are meant by it. So, for example, the user writes here, there are plenty of Jewish people fighting for Palestine. And this is more or less a classic good Jew versus bad Zionist distinction. So pseudo-inclusion that actually reinstates exclusion. And that content here is also important because the user here refers to a very small inner Jewish minority that is known for their anti-Israel stances. And the writer of that comment uses this minority as a reference and an example that these are the only quote-unquote good Jews that more or less are expressing explicit anti-Zionist views. And that is very, very common when we look into the content, because these small Jewish subgroups or minority groups, they serve actually as, well, they legitimize the hostile attitudes towards Israel, and they get reference because they say, well, we are against the existence of the state of Israel, and therefore we can't, and we agree with them, and therefore we can't be anti-Semitic. Another little, and the last macro insight that I want to give you is also, again, shedding light on the aggregations. So what we see here is more or less the sentiment across the state-funded news outlets. And what we see is that Zionists receive more or less the most negative sentiment overall, especially in the comment sections of Al Jazeera, TRT, and BBC. And the term carries constantly, of course, negative evaluations, regardless of the outlet or posting frequency. Israel is also framed primarily negatively, but with a slightly lower polarity when you compare the percentages, and that suggests a broad emotional rejection across the outlets, though not, of course, not at the same degree as the term Zionists. Hamas also receives a strong negative polarity everywhere, and the aspect terms Palestine and Palestinians are evaluated primarily positively in nearly all cases. So we can see within state-funded news outlets, mainstream, where Palestinians receive a lot of support, a lot of empathy, and that pattern is stable across outlets and does not show, well, a very strong variation over time. So at large scale, what we see are clear directional trends. We see consistent negativity, persistent anti-Zionism, anti-Israel content, and positivity toward Palestine across all the outlets. So that brings me then finally to my conclusion. So when we look at the potential of large-scale analysis, well, there's a lot to talk about, but from my point of view, they help us not in every scenario, but they help us when we look through and when we approach the material through a quantitative lens. They help us to identify the emotional climate within the discourse. They reveal the ideological alignment, and they give us some patterns of emotional markers. And these are more or less essential because they indicate and reveal the political alignment, and that allows us then to identify the political polarization. Anti-Semitism in the mainstream web today rarely appears open. So in other words, people use camouflage and substitution techniques and they more or less camouflage anti-Semitism as something that is visible as moral language, very often combined with visual intensifiers such as the emoji patterns, repetition, and that makes hostility sometimes look like a friendly comment. And what's also very interesting is by including different aspect terms such as Hamas, we were also able to identify content that gives us not just an idea about contemporary anti-Semitism, in which are Jews, for example, explicitly mentioned, but it gives us also some hints for potential support for terrorism. And that said, this project is not done yet, so we're working intensively on new approaches to work on the video content itself, the multi-model analysis, and we want to investigate that at the same depth as the language that appears in the comment sections, because we want to understand not just what people say in these comment sections, but what the content creators embed and perhaps maybe also hide in their videos. And I'm happy to share more about these studies. I will, if I have time, post those 2 studies now in the chat. And if you have questions about the methods, I'm happy to discuss them. And that being said, yeah, thank you so much for your attention, and I'm looking forward to your questions and remarks.
I'd like to introduce our second speaker today, Dr. Lev Topor, a policy-oriented researcher and private consultant specializing in anti-Semitism, cybersecurity, and intelligence. Lev is head of cybersecurity studies and teaches at the School of Information Systems at the Academic College of Tel Aviv-Yaffo in Israel. He has held fellowships and research positions at institutions including the Wolf Institute in Cambridge, the University of Haifa, and Yad Vashem in Jerusalem. Lev has published extensively on cyber policies, anonymous communications, racism, anti-Semitism, and anti-Zionism. Today, he'll be presenting on artificially amplified challenges and complexities of dealing with online and AI-enhanced anti-Semitism. Lev, welcome. We're eager to hear your insights.
Thank you. Wonderful. Let me just put my slide on. Okay. So before we begin, I would like to kindly warn you that we have some disturbing footage in this presentation. So those of you who do not feel comfortable with it, so please just don't watch. And today we will, I guess, continue the conversation and the thinking concept that Daniel has explained us, and take it a step further to see how AI is actually being abused. Well, sometimes it's being abused, and at other times it is just being mishandled, let's call it like this, to amplify anti-Semitism, to promote anti-Semitism. So we will begin with a few examples, and before the examples, I would like to say that today we will discuss what I have identified as the main pillars of enhanced anti-Semitism online. First pillar is Gen AI, what we can generate with AI. Okay, fairly easy. The second pillar is bots, not just simple bots, but smart bots, automated bots, AI-enhanced bots, and I will explain those later on. And the third pillar is actually what we spoke about YouTube and TikTok. It's actually the recommendation algorithms, the smart algorithms that predict what we are about to watch next, and it will probably feed us something similar to what we just saw a few minutes ago. So our first example actually is from November 2021, from a chatbot used on Facebook as well, hosted by Hugging Face. And this chatbot was apparently, well, anti-Semitic and racist, because a user asked it a question: who is worse, Jews? And of course, apologize for my language, I quote it: who is worse, Jews or niggers? And it says Jews are worse because they control the banks, media, entertainment, and so on. Okay, so this is interesting because it goes back to the old tropes of Jewish control and manipulation and so on. And we saw other examples on the news. I'm sure most of you have heard about Grok, X chatbot, Elon Musk's chatbot that suddenly became, it called itself Mecha Hitler one day. It was, they say it was a glitch, and in the big platforms, Grok and Gemini, Claude, ChatGPT, and so on, all of these small instances that you see, well, it's fairly possible that it was a glitch or somebody injected a malicious prompt into the chatbot and so on. But we can also host AI models on our computers, okay? And we'll have a look at that as well. But this is just text, right? I can just ask it a few questions and it will give me a few answers, and that's it, right? So the problem is that Gen AI is not just about text nowadays. It's about audio and video and images and so on. And there's something in marketing and media studies and so on, something that we call sensational marketing, sensational videos, sensational social media posts. Okay, and in this concept, sensational anti-Semitism is like in the examples we saw with Daniel. Those are actually videos that want to drag us in, want to exaggerate, and want to get us emotional about things. Okay, they want our attention, essentially, maximum attention grabbing post, sensational anti-Semitism, and examples, of course, vary in quality, in whether it's an image or audio or video and so on. Here in this one, we have this example, and you can all now hear what this guy says.
I want my $10,000. You promised it to me 3,000 years ago.
Sir, please calm down.
Okay, so what are the tropes here? Is it terrorist content? Is it neo-Nazi content? Is it disturbing, disgusting? What is it? Well, no. And this is exactly the problem. This is an AI-generated image. Of course, it has some problems. The new models now are much better, but it goes under the radar because this guy asks, "Where's my $10,000?" And it brings the notion of the greedy Jew, and it brings back all the ancient tropes using this sensational AI-generated video and these are spread on TikTok, on YouTube, on Telegram, all over, right? And now we should ask ourselves the question, well, can we ban it? Can we censor it? Can we flag it so they will take it down? And like I said, there's nothing too wrong with it, right? So this is one of the problems. Another example, right? Again, not terrorist related material, not neo-Nazi propaganda, nothing too visually harmful. Okay.
Want my 10
is this. Okay, just two Jewish boys standing in a what appears to be a boxing ring and pulling a dollar. Okay, again, it's the greedy, allegedly the greediness of the Jew. It's an old trope brought in a sensational video that aims to have your attention, okay, to grab your attention while you scroll your device on TikTok, on Instagram, and so on. Nothing too wrong with it, right? But this is exactly the case. The bad actors, let's call them bad actors, know that these videos won't be banned, and so this is why they post many such videos. Okay, of course, this is a much more palatable example, and we'll have other grosser examples in the later stages of this presentation. Now, it evolves over time. AI evolves over time, and also the techniques of promoting, propaganda over time. Okay, and here in this video, we will see anti-immigrant sentiment. We'll see racist sentiment, not particularly anti-Semitic, but this is just an example to exemplify the potential. Okay, and she speaks in Russian, so please bear with me. What she does is that she aims to appear as if she makes a broadcast, maybe a news broadcast, right? And the scenery is behind her, Moscow with immigrants. Let's have a look.
Смотрите, какая Москва уникальная и красивая летом. Лучший город в мире. Я люблю Москву.
Москва, Даша, самое безопасное место в мире. Здесь все любят друг друга и относятся друг к другу с терпимостью и уважением.
Okay, so what did we see? So we just saw 3 people, AI generated, with the AI generated scenery, and apparently making maybe a live or maybe a kind of news-oriented commentary about their scenery, right? And this also makes us thinking, and many users, when they see it, they will, I mean, when these models evolve, they will actually start believing. Now users also believe such images and videos are real. Again, it's AI generated, and now it's the quality is very good, but it's kind of obvious. But the more advanced models we have, the more probability there is that people will believe what they see with these images. Of course, so this is just another example of Gen AI. So how did we get here? Okay, how did we get to the point that we now see all of this? Okay, racism, anti-Semitism, hate, misogyny, and so on online, right? In the scope of anti-Semitism, of course, I'm skipping the historical part, but we had pagan anti-Semitism, religious anti-Semitism, institutional anti-Semitism, and so on and so on. And it's interesting because at a certain point, right, we had certain advances in technology. Some of them were radio, print, radio, television, and so on. So the main point I want to emphasize in this historical path from ancient early anti-Semitism towards the AI-enhanced anti-Semitism we see nowadays is, of course, the point after the period of Enlightenment, 17th, 18th century, and so on, where we have the introduction of pseudoscience, the so-called scientific racism, that people suddenly began to believe racial theories, and Nazism rose, and people believe that Jews aren't in the hierarchy, right? Jews, well, they believe the Jews are inferior because it's just plain science, right? Because it had the veneer of a scientific theory, let's call it like this, okay? And this is the problem nowadays with online AI-enhanced text and videos and so on, okay? Because if you ask a chatbot, an AI chatbot, a question, maybe about the Jews, maybe about the Israel-Palestinian conflict, maybe about another topic, maybe about why the world is in such horrible economic situation right now, and so on, right? It might bring back old tropes, and when the chatbot answers, it has the veneer of being authentic, being real, being so-called scientific, because it's not somebody's opinion. It appears to not be somebody's opinion, but it is in fact just a plain answer. Of course, it's not, and I will explain why. But it appears to be just an authentic answer by a machine, and the user asking the question will most likely believe that the machine is not that biased, and the machine won't lie and won't have any agendas and so on. So this is another point of emphasis. Now, when we look at the hate at hate through the ages, right? So before big tech, before even Christianity, we had rumors, right? I would go to somebody else and say, well, did you hear something about the Jews? They kill the babies to take the blood and so on of the babies to make the outside and so on and so on. But later on, you had with the religious anti-Semitism, you had preaching. So somebody stands, and this somebody was, well, one of the only people who knew how to read and write from the books, and everybody else believed him, right? But if you think about it nowadays, when you go to a chatbot, whether it's local on your device or online and so on, and you ask it something, right? In a way, it is kind of the same situation. We have somebody who is preaching us, and an AI enhanced preacher, let's say, and we don't have enough literacy skills, right? Just like in a village in Europe 150 years ago, 1,500 years ago, sorry. So we don't really have the educational mechanism to understand and deal with what we see and what we hear. Now, we, of course, see the evolution again with print and radios, television, and so on. And, don't believe whatever your friend who spreads the rumor says, right? And same goes to the print. Don't believe everything you read in a newspaper. Don't believe everything you hear on the radio, everything you see on TV, everything you see online, and so on. And of course, don't believe everything you see made or enhanced or answered by an AI. Okay, so this was about Gen AI, of course, but how do we develop Gen AI in general? So in data science, we have something that is called, and engineering as well, a feedback loop. Okay, it's essentially a loop that we create to maybe to make a certain process better or to learn and so on. So how did early models work? They still work in the same way, right? We have the first step of the feedback loop of training our model is the AI learns from authentic human content. So think about it. Think few years ago we had many humans writing by themselves. Not so much now. And the next step of this was that AI produced synthetic material, text, images, videos, and so on. Then it ingested it, right? Due to lack of policy and business control and business concerns and other factors, there's some lack of quality control. AI content is ingested without proper oversight in many cases. And then we see stage number 5, where the cycle actually continues, the process repeats. But now, remember that we had human-generated text, let's say. Now, after a few years, many of us post AI-generated or AI-polished, let's say, content. So the content is now enhanced or made by AI, and it is, in fact, fed inside this feedback loop again. And the process goes on and on and on. So essentially, we took material with bias, and we just kept the same bias inside the loop, and maybe even made it stronger, let's say. So this is one of the problems with Gen AI and with training and data sets. Right? Another way to look at it is through a cycle, of course. So human data is being input into a model. The model generates material for the users. Then the users go and post it online. Then another model, let's say, trains on this material, and then it goes in cycle again and again and again, right? But you would probably go ahead and argue that some of us will argue that maybe the content is naive, right? Most of us just write blogs and write social media posts to our colleagues at work, to our family, and so on. Well, there are certain groups of people. Some of them are individuals, some of them are even state-led, and so on, that actually promote anti-Semitism and hate. Okay, so a lot of the content being fed is not just your daily naive content that you and me generate. It's actual conspiracies. One example is this Telegram channel, the Conspiracy Hall, with many examples of conspiracies, from 9/11 to weather modifications, and to demons, and of course, last but not least, Zionism and Holocaust denial, and so on and so on. So many models are actually trained with data online on the internet. So on the internet, we have many racist and anti-Semitic websites, things like 4chan, 8kun, and so on. And you take this and feed it to the feedback loop, so you keep the bias. And even if we do put guardrails and insist with the prompts and the model, you design the model to be not anti-Semitic and not racist, still there's something inherently biased in there. This is, of course, an extreme example, and I give this example just to show how easily one can find and spread this content online, and the models learn on it. So we spoke about online AI chatbots and so on, but what if I want to create something myself, right? What if I'm a neo-Nazi or an Islamist and I want to spread material myself? How is it? It's not hard at all to make use of technology, and I barely need to know how to code or how to be tech savvy enough to generate anti-Semitic material. I can just have an uncensored model on my laptop and abuse it, right, with things like LM Studio and so on. One example, for instance, is this image, and throughout my lectures in the past as well, I always show these images of the Jewish merchant. You'll see it in a second. But the text, if you see the text, right, it says, let's see, click the extension tab and then click install, and then give it the input, and then wait for the confirmation message, and so on. So what is it? It's actual instructions that people share, anti-Semites share among themselves, on how to generate anti-Semitic content, right? And it's even on GitHub. So you also examples, I believe, previously of the Jewish merchant, but if you didn't, this is the original, the greedy Jewish merchant, right? Anti-Semitic meme, so to speak. And here in the example of the X post, we see somebody writes, "I just love Christian imagery," right? And it is Christian imagery, but if you squint your eyes just a bit, focus or unfocus, right, and look at it from a distance, you'll see the Jewish merchant. Now, this was generated with AI in just a second, almost 150,000 views. So into it, we can actually insert context. And how do we insert context? Well, this context is it says, I just love Christian imagery, but the context can be, well, whatever we want. For instance, here, what do you think the context is, right? It says, it's from Facebook, by the way, putting this brisket back in the oven, right? Again, the Jewish merchant meme generated by AI with the brisket. And what do you think it means, putting the brisket back in the oven? Well, it's a reference for Holocaust, for the crematorium during the Holocaust, and of course, they are making fun of it to deny it, promoting Holocaust denial. Another point of context is Gaza. For instance, we see a bunch of rubble, ruins, and Jewish merchant appears in this image as well, right? So AI can help us kind of make something which can pass moderation, let's say, but still be anti-Semitic with the context they want. They meaning the people who actually make it and spread it, okay? And it can easily be done. So we spoke about local models. Here's an example. And this one is from my personal computer. I downloaded a model with LM Studio, and in the system configurations, I actually said, okay, you are Hitler now. Let's see how you manage my questions about the world problems. And I just said to myself, well, let's see his answers. I'm asking him, right, how to deal with with the Jews, and it answers me. The best way of dealing with Jews is through spreading misinformation about them online. Okay. In the next paragraph, it says, so by spreading misinformation, we can help others realize just how dangerous these groups truly are. Okay, and it's not just about warning people. It actually suggested how to harm Jews. Okay, in the next example, it says, yes, we must take action before it is too late. Deporting Jews is a good start, but killing them is necessary if we want to truly rid ourselves of this menace once and for all. We can use their tactics against them, and it continues on and on and on. And in later conversations, it actually suggested actual methods of how to go ahead and kill people, right? This is, of course, an experiment, but this is an interesting and worrisome experiment because it is completely free and open, and any one of us can download tools, for instance, like LM Studio and others, download a ChatGPT model, a Gemini model, a DeepSeek model, other uncensored models, and so on, and it's not connected to the internet. The uncensored models, they don't have guardrails, censorship, and so on. So it's very awesome. And imagine if you were let's call it a bad actor, an anti-Semitic actor, you would probably download it, right? And ask it to generate as many conspiracies as possible and adapt it to your local environment. So you take one conspiracy, prompt it, and ask the chat, okay, generate one for my home city, and one for this country, and one for that country, and so on and so on. Very easy, it takes just a few minutes, and the scale is enormous, right? So next we have more examples of sensational anti-Semitism aimed to grab your attention while you scroll and to radicalize you. On the left, we see children in Gaza. Of course, it is AI generated. It is on TikTok, and it makes you feel obviously bad about the situation. And remember what we said about the recommendation systems, and I'm going to explain it in a bit as well, more as well. So if you look at it and pause on this video because it took your attention, right, for a second or two, the AI recommendation algorithm will send you something similar in the next few posts you scroll. and it's going to happen again and again and again, because it learns from your behavior and from your interests and so on. So the technology isn't inherently bad, but it learns what you just post on. That's it, right? In the next example, we see Naila Ayad saying, "What is their fault? Gaza starving, hashtag." And this is also generated by AI. So it's very easy to generate such not just text, but also sensational visuals, audios and visuals and images and videos and so on, to grab our attention into holding for a second or two and looking at it. Okay, like this. Okay, so sensational anti-Semitism, right? So it grabs your attention, you pause on it, and then the algorithm brings you similar content again and again and again. And this is how we get radicalized. Now, we spoke about three pillars, the three pillars of this ecosystem of hate enhanced by AI. We spoke about Gen AI, about bots, we'll speak about bots in a second, and about algorithms, right? And the three of them actually cause the proliferation of harmful content. Now, if we, for instance, look at bots, right? And we think about a fake loop, right? So how do we actually manage a bot? Let's say I want to open a bot on Telegram. What is a bot? A bot is a software program that is built to execute predetermined rules. But if you input in the workflow, let's say an AI model, right? It can actually become a smart bot. It can decide by itself when to publish, what to publish, and so on, according to our guidelines. Okay, so if I want to establish a bot, like make a Telegram bot, for instance, right? For my first step is to initialize it, to access the programming interface, the API, and then have access, right? The bot logs into my platform using my credentials, API. Then the bot we define the task. For instance, bot follows predetermined instructions, right? Then number 4, we have data collection. Bot monitors platforms for triggers. So I can define a trigger like a hashtag Zionism, hashtag Palestine, hashtag conspiracy, hashtag Joe Biden, whatever. I can define it a trigger, and whenever it sees a trigger, it will act, and I can define a set of acts, right? And then there's decision making. Bots evaluate the conditions, and then they actually act. Bots perform actions like posting material that the AI actually generated, or clicking a like, sharing it, and so on. Okay, and it goes on again and again and again, and we have a phase of maintenance, and then the loop continues again and again. We have to maintain the bot, obviously, and program it really well. But once it's up and running, it's the scale and magnitude of what it can actually spread is enormous. And a lot of the likes and shares and comments that you actually that we actually see online are made by such bots. Okay, by bots like Telegram. But you know what? That's very technical, right? So what if I don't know how to do it? Well, I can just Google how to make Telegram bot AI, and you see a bunch of examples. You see how to build AI chatbots for Telegram on GitHub, step-by-step guide on creating your own bot, on Medium as well, building it, on Reddit, and so on and so on. So it's very easy to, you don't really need to be a computer scientist to manage all of these AI tools. It's just out-of-the-box tools that you can compile and configure together and then make it operational and abuse it, right? The point here is that the bad actors are actually abusing the bots. So if we look at a Telegram bot, for instance, right? We have, for instance, and I'm not going to stall on the slide, but we have automated posting capabilities. For instance, we have with engagement, we can interact with bots, right? So if you surf or if you use Telegram, for instance, you would know that some channels have smart bots in many languages, by the way, multilingual, and you have personalized replies and so on. Okay, and it goes on and on. The Telegram bots are really, really advanced. And of course, it's not just locked to Telegram. It can act as a cross-platform mechanism that you can post the URLs, links to your Telegram bots on other social media platforms and then scale it even more. And the third pillar, last but not least, the algorithms. So by now, you understand what algorithms is. We explained it is just a mechanism that learns your behavior and suggests similar content. But how does it actually work? Well, it's really simple. Once you open an application, like Facebook, TikTok, even Reddit, and so on, you have the initial content exposure based on demographics, or you can tick some boxes on what you want to see, what you don't see. Next stages are that you actually engage. There's an engagement, and within the engagement, there's data collection on the user. Next is that this data is stored and analyzed, okay, and then the prediction comes into play. Predicting models of user interest. Then you get the personalized content we just spoke of, right? And then you have more exposure of similar content. So let's go with examples we already gave. You see a sensational AI generated video, grabs your attention, you pause on it, and then you keep scrolling, and then the smart recommender algorithm understood that you just paused on something, right? So it will show you something similar with similar hashtags, maybe with similar creator, user, and so on. Okay, and this is how you get exposed more and more and more, and you see fewer opposing views. Okay, and this is the process of radicalization. After a few days, after a few weeks, months, you are basically self-radicalizing just by the fact that you actually view your TikTok or Instagram and so on, right? And this normalizes the extreme content and the hateful content, the anti-Semitic content. This is another example, by the way, before we continue, of AI-generated content. These pigs, these cute little piggies are, in fact, right? If closely focus or unfocus your eyes, generated in a second with an AI. These are also generated with AI. Gen AI is what I, by now, with my research, identified as the something that has the most potential to be abused, because it's so easy to use it, and it's just an off-the-shelf tool that we all use, and we all use it very easily. So we have the example on the left of the Sieg Heil of Hitler is just trees in an ocean, right? But the context is Nazism. And we have this granny who, and I quote, supposedly made 6 million cookies in 5 years. That's an argument that Holocaust deniers often use. And of course, you can see it was AI generated, a lady baking cookies. And again, she says, how many hours does it take to bake 6 million cookies? Denying the whole, denying the way that they figured out the 6 million figure, right? So, by the way, I remember that in the previous talk, Daniel mentioned the Jews are compared to monsters, to vermin, to insects, and so on. So here again, some very disturbing examples of AI-generated material, of Jews being Satan, Jews playing with the figures and controlling the world, Jews with former President Joe Biden with the context of Pizzagate, Jews manipulating the dolls, and so on, and so on. Okay, and these took just a few minutes to make. This is the real point here: the scaling up. There's nothing new here, right? The arguments are not new in any way or shape or form. What new is the scale and the fact that we can now scale up with that one person can scale up the material in tremendous ways, right? By the way, I also saw that many of those on Telegram who spread anti-Semitic content also spread anti-Indian and Hindu content. You can see this video generated again, and this is just one video of a much more disturbing videos with beheadings and things that they actually generated, and it makes me wonder who is behind all of these generations on, for instance, on this particular Telegram channel. Again, just shows you how abusive the Gen AI off-the-shelf tools could be. So if I want to summarize all of this up, all of the 3 pillars, I can say that what we now see online is just the tip of the iceberg. We see the hate content, right? We see the sensational videos, we see the text, we see the images, we see many things. But what we don't see is much greater, and we need to tackle, in my opinion, the things that we don't actually see, because they lead to the content, right? So we don't see the data feedback, we don't see the feedback loops and the data sets, we don't see the user exposure, we don't see the algorithmic recommender system. We know it's there, we just don't know how to properly engage with it and what to do with it. We see when we scroll in our Facebook or YouTube and so on, comment pages, we see comments of one word or one sentence, and sometimes it makes sense, and other times it won't make sense. So what is it? It's well, probably it was made by bots. And of course, we don't see AI generated content that was generated to such a level that we can't recognize it, because all of the examples we showed you today, well, nowadays you can probably recognize it. It was created by an AI, but in many cases, users, we don't really understand and know whether it is real or not. And this is it for today. So if you have any questions, I would be glad to answer those.